It's time for another movie fight review, this time from El Cid, 1961. Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria. For anyone who doesn't know, I'm a fencing instructor, I'm an antique weapons dealer, and I also consult with TV and movies and stuff like that, and occasionally appear in documentaries. But what we're doing here is doing a breakdown of a fight in a very famous movie, a movie that I was introduced to myself when I was really quite a young kid by my dad, because it was one of my dad's favourite movies, and he'd in fact seen it in the cinema when it was first released in 1961. So this is the famous El Cid, featuring, of course, the incomparable Charlton Heston, and he really owns this role. Now, before we go into the fight review, just a brief comment about who was El Cid. Well, his real name was Rodrigo Diaz de Vivar, and he was a Spanish national hero, essentially, who fought against Islamic forces and some people would say kind of began this process of Reconquista, which went all the way through to the 15th century, of essentially fully Christianizing Spain and driving out the Moors as they're commonly known. El Cid actually takes his name, it's derived from the Arabic, meaning the master or the lord, and essentially he was a very successful warlord. He was a knight of Castile, and he was a very successful leader of armies against Muslim forces. Now obviously the movie plays fast and loose with history, we're not going to criticize it for that, we're just going to look at one particular fight. I have looked at another fight from this movie before, but this is a lesser known fight probably, but it is a sword fight. It's single sword versus single sword, and for the context of this, my main historical criticism of the movie as a whole, and you'll see specifically about some of the swords and weapons and armour in this movie, is that they are completely incorrect for when it's supposed to be set. So El Cid actually lived in the second half of the 11th century. That is, he was born around 1044, I think, and died, I think, in 1099. So he is around at the same time as William the Conqueror, for example. So he is a contemporary of William the Conqueror and William's sons. So he is, you should imagine him like a Norman. So when you picture the Bayeux Tapestry, that's what El Cid should look like. He should have a mail hauberk, he should carry a teardropped kind of Norman-style shield, he should carry a simple cross-hilted sword, use a lance on horseback, spear on foot, and should have a conical helmet, probably with a nasal at the front. Now, we do see some shields and armour in El Cid which are correct, but a lot of it is completely wrong. But without further ado, let's actually just get into the movie fight review. So this is a part of a playlist which goes back a decade on my channel. I haven't done any for a while, but I'm reviving them now. So if you're a regular or a new watcher, then if you want me to do specific movies, old movies, new movies, TV shows, whatever, even video games, get posting in the links down below. What would you like to see me do a review of? And if you haven't seen any of my movie fight reviews before, check out, I've got a whole playlist of them that goes back 11 years, I think. So there's loads of stuff to watch there. Right, now let's get on with this fight from El Cid. Absolutely lavish scenery. The sets are gorgeous in this movie. So I absolutely love the detail there that El Cid pulls out the scabbarded sword out of the belt system so that it's still got the scabbard on, and then sheds the scabbard off like that. That's a good way of not having a scabbard hanging around by your side while you're having a fight. It's also moderately historical, although this particular scabbard setup is much later than the Norman period, and it even would be quite late for the period of the sword, and that's an important thing to note. So the sword that El Cid, or Charlton Heston, is using here is specifically modelled on a sword which is associated with El Cid and was supposedly one of his swords. However, if you look at that hilt, that is a 16th century style hilt. That is absolutely nothing to do with the 11th century. Some people might argue the blade might be older and might be an 11th century blade. I'm not going to get into that here. Maybe I'll do a dedicated video about that. If you'd like me to make a dedicated video about that topic, get posting down below. There's also comparable famous swords of famous people that clearly didn't belong to them, but maybe some parts of them did. Anyway, this is not an 11th century sword, it's a 16th century sword, like hundreds of years out completely. So don't imagine that any Norman knight would have had a sword like this. Although amusingly, his adversary's sword is actually pretty good for the 11th century. It's completely passable. So while El Cid's sword, completely wrong, 500 years too late, the sword of his opponent is actually pretty good. Tiny detail, but with this type of sword, it has 2 finger rings. Usually you put your index finger over the guard, fingering the guard, as I sometimes refer to it, with this style of 16th century hilt. Of course, he shouldn't be having a 16th century hilt, firstly, but secondly, it's not a big criticism because it is also okay to not put your finger over the guard, and there are period fencing treatises where they don't do that, despite the fact that they could if they wanted to. So while it would be usual to put the finger over the guard when there's a guard there for the finger, a finger ring, you don't have to. Also worth stating that in this period, in the 11th century, you wouldn't normally use a sword by itself. You'd usually use it with a shield, and sword designs of the 11th century are very much kind of designed or intended to be used with shields. So they're not particularly nimble, they don't have a lot of hand protection. Don't think of them like later period rapiers or sabres. They are primarily designed to be used with shields. Not to say you can't use them by themselves, but this wasn't how they were intended to be used. Couple of little jabs there, no problem with that. But then Rodrigo El Cid parries really, really high. And this is a common criticism I will have of this entire fight, is that he makes his parries and his blows very overly dramatically done. When you're actually fighting against someone with the intention of them not hitting you and you successfully hitting them, you keep the movements a little bit tighter. If someone's attacking your head, you don't put the arm all the way up here. You parry just above, just high enough to have a bit of shock absorbency to the blow, but not so high that it creates a massive great opening below the sword. El Cid doing massive great swings there, very, very overly dramatic against an unarmoured opponent just wearing clothes. The motions could be a lot more constrained. They don't need to be as full armour massive as this. And in fact, with period steel swords, you massively increase the chance of breaking the weapons when you strike into someone's sword that hard. More on that point in a second. So one thing I do really like is they are going for lots of different targets. They're going from high to low and they're going to different sides. So the choreographer has thought about variety. And however I critique this fight and say, oh, this isn't accurate or that isn't accurate, it is fundamentally entertaining. And that is, of course, the main goal. So I do quite like the grab and the push away there. That is completely historical. It's something you can do. In the historical fencing treatises of the 14th, 15th, 16th centuries, we do see the use of the left hand used quite a lot to grab the opponent's wrist and hand and body, grappling, wrestling, but additionally sometimes to grab the opponent's blade as well, or push it or ward it aside. So if you've parried, you can take over with the left hand. The left hand's now taking control of the opponent's weapon, and that frees up your weapon to attack them. So I really like the fact that they've included that in there. So one thing I'm not hugely keen on is their swords are meeting in the middle and they're cutting into each other a lot. So if a cut's coming in here, you would tend to ward it, either point up or point down, or beat, rebat, either beating it from above or deflecting it from below. So you'd be thinking more about defensive actions. So there is, in real fencing, there's more of a disparity between what's an offensive action and a defensive action. Here it looks like both people are mashing their swords into each other, and that's of course because of the way that the actors are taught in the choreography. They are taught, okay, you meet this way with the swords, then that way with the swords, then down here with the swords. So what they're essentially doing is something akin to pat a cake, but with swords. They're clashing the swords into each other, and they're not really aiming at each other because they're not really attacking and they're not really defending. And it's a little bit obvious here. I do like that there was some blade on blade action there, and that's really, really good. That shows that the choreographer almost certainly has fencing, real fencing experience. And if we were doing German longsword or Langmesser, for example, we would call this winden, is the German term. So when the blades are in contact, instead of always detaching and striking again, detach and strike, very often the two blades will, strikes come in and a defences come in, and in that moment, the blade changes direction and slides from a new angle, a new direction, while still being in contact with the opponent's blade. And that is actually represented here, which I love. So where Elcid is trapped up against a column there, unfortunately it becomes a little bit too obvious that that his opponent is attacking into his sword. So if someone's against a column with their sword held here and the opponent is just basically attacking into the sword, you know they're not really trying to hit the person. Anybody out there, doesn't matter whether you trained fencing or not, if someone stands there with their back to a wall or a column with the sword held here, you're not going to strike into the sword. You're going to strike somewhere, you know, down below or to the other side or thrust. You're going to attack the person instead of their sword. And it's a little bit obvious in this fight that they are attacking each other's swords. Also, as they come away from the column there, notice the distance. You can see where they're striking at each other's swords. If the other person just moved their sword out of the way, the attacker's sword would go whistling past. They're not in distance. And this is another problem or thing to watch out for with stage and screen choreography. The fights at each other's swords are usually done out of distance. When we attack each other in real fencing and real martial arts, you attack such that if the opponent didn't defend, your weapon's going to hit the person. That means you need to be close enough to hit the person with your sword. And we can see when they pan out from above here that the distance is completely wrong for a real fight because they are clashing their swords against each other. They are not close enough to hit each other. Okay, now when you're filming choreographed scenes like this, you should try and use, you know, upwind or downwind angles so that the audience can't necessarily tell that the distance is too wide. When you pan up and look down like this, you can very graphically see that they are sword tip touching distance and they're not close enough to hit. So this grabbing the arms up high, this is a really, really common thing. We can see it in loads of movies, even until, you know, the modern day, but certainly in things like Star Wars and Lord of the Rings and loads of stuff. Now, when you come into a position where two people are locked, essentially you're wrestling at this point. The swords are not functioning as swords. They're held up out of the way and both people have got a grip or grapple on each other. At this point, if we look at real martial arts with surviving lineages like Kenjutsu, or even Bujinkan, things like that. If we look at old school kendo, or indeed if we look at Western martial arts, European martial arts, where there's treatises and manual surviving and people are recreating it like me, there's wrestling moves in here. So there's all sorts of things you can do in this scenario. You might put your hip behind the other hip and throw the person. You might just trip them with the lower leg. You might knee them. You might elbow them, headbutt them. All sorts of. You might do a disarm. You can wrap one arm over and wrap around. You can do disarms. There's absolutely loads. I mean, dozens and dozens and dozens of tactical options to do from this point. But they almost never do them in movies. Usually they come to this point, sometimes they exchange some dialogue for acting and kind of storyline purposes, and then they break apart again to sword fighting distance. Which is exactly what they do here, disappointingly. Again there, the blades crossed and they come into wrestling distance, but does any wrestling happen? A headbutt, a punch, a disarm, a knee, no nothing, just push away. And it's so disappointing because actually, if they'd just done, ba-dam, if they'd just done a symbolic elbow in there or a shove away, that would look a bit more convincing, or even a trip or a headbutt or something like that, which they do in some movies and some TV shows they have done it. It would have made it look more like a fight and less like a choreographed kind of stage performance. It would have made it look more fighty, basically, because more people can relate to fisticuff fighting than they can to sword fighting. And this bit when he comes hitting, unfortunately, I think this is one of the worst bits of the whole fight from a fencer's point of view, because you can really see that Rodrigo, El Cid, Charlton Heston, is putting his sword in place and the other person is striking into it. It doesn't at all look like someone trying to hit another person. It looks like a person going, okay, I'm going to put my sword over here, you strike to it, well done. Now I'm going to put my sword here, you strike to it, well done. So it literally looks like painting by numbers, like they're just going through the sequence. And to me, it doesn't look at all like a fight. And again, a clinch. A clinch. Is something exciting going to happen? Oh, the blades are coming down across the neck. Maybe this is going to be something really cool. No, it's just another push away. How boring. Honestly, I feel like most of the tension in this fight is actually coming from the music rather than the fight. Again, putting the sword up there for it to be hit. Every time Charlton Heston puts his sword in a place, the other person hits the sword. It doesn't look like a real fight. And something else that really bugs me about this fight is how cumbersome the thrusts are. The thrust kind of are given with this weird bent arm lurching. They're moving the sword like it's a really, really heavy object. And in fairness, they don't move the cuts that much like they're a crazy heavy object. They do over-exaggerate the cuts, as I said right at the beginning. However, the thrusts are like hugely over-exaggerated, possibly for safety reasons, I don't know, or to make it more obvious what's happening. Maybe it's a distance thing, I don't know. But then also, disappointingly, as you can see, they finished the fight, and I think this is a terrible way of doing it. They finished the fight behind a staircase. Like, who does that? Who finishes a fight behind a staircase? Anyway, to sum up, I know I've been pretty harsh here. But that's because I do love this movie. And in fact, this movie has lots of really, really good fights in it. But I just felt that this fight could have been so much better. And actually I didn't hate the fight, largely thanks to the soundtrack. I thought the music and the tension introduced by the music was absolutely phenomenal. But the fight itself could have been so much better. There we go. What did you think? Did you think it was great? Obviously, you can look online and see fuller, uninterrupted and unedited versions of this fight, which I can't do for copyright reasons. But hopefully this breakdown has been interesting. Were there some things that you noticed that I didn't mention or that you'd like me to expand on? And also importantly, what other movies would you like me to do a movie fight review of? I hope to see you back on the channel really soon. Thanks a lot for watching. Cheers, folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.